Thank you. I think a lot of what I'm going to say, it's amazing how the presentations are all linked to each other and segueing beautifully in ways that you couldn't have planned. I suppose what I wanted to begin with, and it leads on from some of what Catherine said as well, is that people were at the heart of this, and I was in fact impacted and flooded in my house in Brisbane in New Farm, and all of the experiences that I had at home with my family and with my neighbourhood were replicated here at work. You know, the up and down, the not believing it's going to happen. Yes, it's going to happen. My family's at Stradbroke. I'm here. What are we going to do? How are we going to manage it? Also, some of the feelings that I think a lot of people had is, oh, it actually wasn't that bad. There were people who were worse off than us, or I found myself in the washing machine there. The National Museum was up here talking to us, and they were enormously interested in whether they could secure this washing machine for their collection. And I couldn't reconcile my personal experience and thinking it's just a washing machine with a broader cultural collections, objects telling stories, even though I've spent my life doing that. So being in that situation and experiencing it. Also, despite having moved a lot of material, there were some of our own photographs that got flooded. And so it was also in that panic situation of trying to dry those things out, remember what I'd been taught, and the emotional impact of that sort of time. And that's the Mud Army coming. That's before the official Mud Army came with the proper T-shirts. These were people who just turned up with coffee and buckets and squeegees, and the sort of sheer relief that people were coming to help. So when Catherine was talking, I can't remember when I came back to the library. I remember talking to people, trying to get a sense of where the team was at, how other people were going, and what the story was. But it is a blur as well. And then the other things that we've faced here at the library as well is simply the thousands of photos I took on my iPhone, the thousands of posts that were put on Facebook. My experience of that is, and when I was going back to try and remember exactly what happened, some of the Facebook posts have disappeared because Facebook doesn't guarantee that things will stay there, and that it's actually only the comments on the photographs that survive. So you realise that actually the experience, even though it's only 12 months ago, that the record of that and the reconstructing of that, has disappeared. So one of the things, the couple of images that Catherine used as well, one of the things that when we were reflecting on how we respond to the floods and the disaster of Yazzie is we came across the writing and thinking about the life cycle of a collection. And that actually the life cycle gave us a mechanism by which to make some decisions about what to collect and how to collect it and who to work with in terms of that. And I think it is that pre-event. What are all of the things that happened? It was me on the couch on Monday night not thinking it was going to happen. Why wasn't I moving stuff, For the organisation for Queensland, it's like, how had we forgotten that the river flooded? Like, how did we collectively forget that? It's then, when it becomes inevitable that it's going to happen, it's the emergency, it's actually the acute stage, when the effects of the disaster are being felt and you're responding in that way. The intermediate phase, where those short-term needs, the long-term recovery, and the resolution. And I think we're all on that life cycle at different stages. There are some communities at different points in that. Some stages will take years to get through, and I think the Christchurch stories have been incredibly sobering in terms of thinking about the life cycle and thinking it through, because I'll get to that when I suppose that the thing that while most museum and library collections were safe during the natural disasters, and we're going to hear from Cardwell about one that wasn't. That actually, the summer of 2010-11, there was a profound loss of Queensland's memory, because it's not just what's in our collections, it's what's in the houses and the communities and the things that were in our haste to clean up that were lost. And they're things that we won't know we've lost, or people will look for the photo of Granny and not be able to find it. That I think there are things that we need to do about working with emergency organisations in terms of getting information out even more quickly, that things can be salvaged, that not everything has to go to the tip. I mean, Brisbane City Council filled up 5 years of rubbish or whatever it was in a couple of days, because people were just getting rid of things that didn't necessarily need to be got rid of. And that certainly happened in New Farm, where the Mud Army were great, but they also took things that shouldn't have been, that could have been salvaged. I think the other role is that that I wanted to talk about is, and is probably the primary area, is the role of galleries and libraries and museums in terms of collecting and understanding the 2010-11 events. I think as soon as they were happening, everyone knew it was being talked about, that this was a new milestone in our history. This quote from Anna Bligh in her condolence speeches: if never there was a call to arms of history and history collections, that sense of which, the story that must be recorded, that future generations must know. What is it that we play? What is it that we can gather together, that we remember? We try and remember what happened, but also that we create spaces for understanding what happened, for bringing communities together to talk about it, to make meaning. And I don't think we'll quite know the full impact for many years, but there's a hunger and a desire there to be part of that. So, I suppose the other thing I wanted to reflect on is that network that we have of Queensland memory organisations, people collecting the state's history, is that what happened during the floods, and particularly the floods, because it was here in Brisbane, is that it built on the strengths and the weaknesses of that distributed network. So it actually wasn't the time to solve big, more structural issues about how we work together and what do we do and what do you do. It was, in the end, it was self-organising, that people, knew what they had to do. They reached out. There was this huge amount of goodwill, but you were sort of working around that. So there were things that different institutions and the library was well placed to do. Things like the social media and the use of online spaces. The library had been in that space. The commitment to contemporary collecting, very much a library's purview, and that we were able to extend and build on that. The working with the role of public libraries and working with them, and of museum development officers who are employed by the museum and are based in the regions, of how to work with those networks, and the local museums. I think one of the stories that reveals that is Mark Kempton was an amazing helicopter pilot who rescued 30 or 35 people from the roofs of houses in the Lockyer Valley. And so he donated his uniform and the winch that was used to pick up the babies and the parents, and they're in the Queensland Museum's collection. State Library, with our commitment to oral histories and digital stories, we have done, full-on interviews with him, a real record of what happened and how it transpired, and the photographs and the visual material. So it is that working around each other, and as the public would expect, us working together, not competitively or... So they were. So some of the things that we were able to do to build a collection, Build Queensland Memory for Future Generations, is well, State Library has 2 photographers, Leif's here and I think Josie. They took thousands of photographs. And Leif was very quick off the mark and set up a camera on the 5th floor on a timer to take pictures every 4 minutes. Or
initially every 30 minutes, and then when we got back in here a couple of days later, every 15 minutes.
So it's this fantastic time lapse of the flood just outside our window. So that was fantastic to be able to do, and those were made pretty quickly available online because people did want to see what had happened here at the library. The other things with staff being able to be offline or not be out of the building and working is we set up a Flickr account, and I think other institutions have done that in terms of responses of gathering information as well as looking there ourselves, of asking people to self-identify through Flickr. One of the first photographers to contact us was through Flickr. A photographer who lived in Grantham and had been there and had taken photographs almost immediately. It was the community we least expected to be so responsive, but I think that desire to share that information, to recognise the significance of what happened, was also something that we could offer in that way. So we had, Catherine sort of talked a little bit about this earlier, and while the speech notes of Anna Bly's at that moment are in State Archives collection, it was part of that whole initiative to be how do we capture, how do we keep the full spectrum of what happened. And when you compare these speech notes to the very polished Anna Bly that you saw on the TV, or the transcript of actually what she said. These are the prompts to her, and again, very revealing in terms of. I love that one where it sort of says, "Don't forget about the regions." Central. It wasn't just all about Brisbane; it was actually happening everywhere, and there were people scared and fearful everywhere. We also did a lot of work, and as everyone, or as many people in the room would know, the difficulties involved in capturing social media for the future is very difficult. But we were able to, and there was amazing effort around capturing the websites. So the police website, which included their Twitter feed, was captured. The Anna Bly's the same, so that. That some of that sense of the urgency and the communication changes were done in that way, and it was fantastic with the National Library also committing and capturing websites as well, like the ABC's. The other thing is, I don't think there's not like disaster collecting or flood collecting isn't finished. It continues, and at the very, very long tail of the work that we're doing. So there are political ephemera that we're gathering by the truckload at the moment, and that's the Treasurer Andrew Fraser trading on his role in the flood for his electorate. So it's part of a lot of the material that continues to come in, including this music manuscript from Elena Katzer-Chernin of a Symphony of the Floods that was commissioned, where she actually uses words from Anna Bly's speech and the suburbs that were affected. So you can see that the creative response will be ongoing in terms of Queenslanders and others making sense of what happened. Very, very, always legal deposit can always come to every conversation. Legal deposit, this is the main issue I wanted to say here is the manual this is the manual that was used by the dam operators that we realised we didn't have in the collection, and some very dogged staff made a determined effort to secure one of those, and now this is the document that's being contested as we're all seeking to find someone to blame for what happened and the ongoing impact of that. And why I say that, it's just so amazing, the parallels with the fires and with what we're doing, what we've been thinking as well, is that it's also been this time to reassess existing collections. That actually that's one of the conservators, Gadendra, looking after a flood map from 1893 of Brisbane. We'd had it here for years. We knew it was important, but we didn't know how important it was. And this was new, having experienced the full force of a flood, the impact of it, of recasting our eye over existing material. And we are curating an exhibition based on this that opens, very soon. Yeah, there's lots I can say, because everything that's happening now happened in the 1890s, including from the looters who came to the flood inquiries to actions not being taken, for people looking for people to blame for what occurred. But I think that's been what's been sort of more revealing and more not embarrassing but more revealing is the 1974 flood event. That really we've got more insights into 1893 than you do for 74, that active collecting. We do have a lot, and we have photographs, and in fact we should have known, we should have been guided by the crowd. Our most popular images on Picture Queensland or through our website are actually floods in 1974, so these images are in the top 10 of the searches. And just before the server collapsed, or the systems went down, the searches that everyone was coming to the website for was to see where water had come to on their street. That desperate need to know, what does it mean? I knew we were affected, but that's exactly what happened at home. We knew when we bought the house 20 years ago that it had been affected by the flood, but was that with the dam or without the dam? And it didn't matter in the end, but because we were flooded. So 74, and Queensland Museum shared with me that they didn't have any objects from 1974, and actually the call out that they did for material from the more recent floods brought through one object. So I think, I'll come to that. What are we doing to record that space? Which way do I... So I think that the idea of libraries being spaces for discussion, dialogue, access to expertise, when we did finally get to reopen the building, that a lot of the opening weekends were based around understanding what had happened. So we did talks. We also did, in a shared way with Queensland Museum, access to conservators, so that people who had objects, and the conservation clinics, and again just being a place where people could come and understand. The library also was involved in a project called the Flood of Ideas, which was working with designers, with communities, with Brisbane City Council, in terms of, what are the ideas that we can have? How can we, having just been through it, how can we try and understand how we could, so they don't want to, people were keen, it seemed, to not just understand and see what happened, but they wanted to be part of creating a response to that. So whether it was, or it included projects with children and coming up with activities, create, ideas for those, or this very practical one, which I'd like for my street, is actually putting markers on your telegraph poles of where the water came to, because just like Anne-Marie's quote earlier, you can't believe it. It just doesn't make sense that water was that high. So it's those online engagement, and that did lead to use of the collections of people coming up and seeing, what were the solutions that came out of 1893 or out of 1974. This is an organisation called Green Cross, and they're wanting to help build the resilience of Queensland. I think it's an international program, but they are also using historical material, trying to let people understand suburb by suburb, place by place, what happened, and we're working with them. The next part I just wanted to talk briefly, because it's primarily been about State Library and the work that we've been doing, but Queensland Museum, of the role of exhibitions. So the exhibitions can become catalysts, and Queensland Museum did a display fairly early on, I think, for their reopening, and that was a call for items to the collection. They then also did this exhibition, which they then reopened again this year in January, and had an exhibition of bouncing back about resilience and the community. So you can see there, they've collected more of the artefacts of the T-shirts and the squeegees and the uniforms and the winches, and gathering community stories as well of being that place for a discussion. They also didn't photograph as well, more of the science as well, of the ecology of the river and the impact on the river. I think after today at 4:30 you'll see a preview of the exhibition that State Library has been working on, or it's two exhibitions, Floodlines, which is in the SLQ Gallery, which is looking at the 2010-11, the impact of that. And that exhibition has become a catalyst for a lot of collecting, a lot of thinking and partnering with people and organisations that are also working in this area. At the heart of Floodlines, that's probably my prejudice, but is a mosaic, a huge wall of community-created content that will continue throughout the life of the exhibition. And at the moment now it's grown it's now 63 public libraries have committed to adding content that will be displayed and be part of the wall. It is then part of that we can select for the collection from that, but it's involving a much broader community in valuing and thinking about their records of that time. So, I just, in developing the presentation, I thought, well, it's always good to think about what are the things that we did well. What was what are the things that people could take away, that you could work with in your institutions, in your communities. I think that we were able to establish that public institutions are an appropriate place for the documentary record. That we were out there, it wasn't that it was seen as separate from us. That there was initial early contact with key state agencies. We also had a lateral and broad approach, and we made it a priority. So we didn't secure extra funding or any additional resources for the flood and disaster Yazi collecting, but we just had to make it a priority with existing resources. The collaboration that we did with the National Library, the using exhibitions and event as a focal point for the collecting initiatives, and the use of social media to identify potential material. A lot of things came that would have taken a lot longer to surface through the traditional methods. I suppose when I was developing the talk, I didn't want it just to be about capturing what happened now and going after it. It was also about, well, what is it that we did to preserve Queensland memory, that the houses, the families, the communities, the organisations whose material was lost. And we did get information out in the media fairly quickly. And we had material on the website, but if you couldn't access the website, it was all that sort of spiralling, but how to get good information out. The conservation clinics, that advice, and the use of the professional networks, the role of the conservators, as they're just phenomenal. They need a whole talk on their own. Yeah. So next was the better, which is always. It was the coping with sheer quantity of the material, all the issues with Born Digital. We didn't solve any of them. They were just more starkly revealed. That it was an event of national consequence. Could we have collaborated more with interstate groups? And we didn't, we could have collaboratively got funding for collection building, that could have been a message. How do we get the message out about salvaging movable cultural heritage to individuals and communities? How do we make sure that that's there, the regional networks and working collaboratively? So I think all those things. So just quickly, because it just happened yesterday, I think that what happened in Queensland and particularly in Brisbane was so dramatic and so overwhelming that it's now, well, it's not over, because there are continuing natural disasters. We have to get good at this. We have to get good at assessing significance about responsiveness. Charleville, Townsville, particularly these images here by Tina on Dwan, these are the king tides that are literally eating the island away. So how do we continue to respond? It wasn't a one-off. And lastly, and I think this is exactly where Sarah left as well, it's how do we advocate for the significance of this material, that there are people who won't give us copyright permissions in government departments for websites because I don't know why, but we want their record. It's still, to be that voice of saying, well, what is the record going to be of how we experience this? Because if we're not doing it now, it's not going to be here to keep, as I found with my Facebook site. Now, this painting, it's exactly that story. This is a painting of a football that was found on the beach at Maroochydore, and it had a phone number on. They rang the phone number, and it was the only belongings. It was one of only a few belongings of a household who'd been flooded. So, it's that poignancy of the material that we have and using that to advocate for the work that we do. Thank you.
Building.